If you're trying to pick the better bike between the Honda and the Royal Enfield, let me show you a major flaw in how reviews are made and consumed. Have you ever watched a movie on a friend's recommendation that turned out to be an utter waste of your time? Well, that can happen with motorcycle reviews too. Despite the best intentions, reviewers, including myself, can sometimes lead you to the wrong bike. And I've got two words for you: biases and experiences, which, by the way, can vary even between identical twins. But instead of making this a TED Talk, let's try and objectively compare Honda and Royal Enfield's versions of small capacity adventure touring motorcycles. And along the way, I'll try and show you how to avoid making the wrong choice despite my inability to read your mind. I rode the NX500 here in Daytona Beach, Florida, and loved the mid-range smoothness for highway cruising. It does feel sportier, but that's more because of the suspension and geometry, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But the Himalayan, as it's called in the US, or Himalayan as I have been corrected by folks in India, after all, has a single cylinder engine, so it obviously cannot match Honda's twin cylinder smoothness. But for actual cruising, they're surprisingly well matched. Both transmissions are slick individually, but when you ride them back to back, you cannot deny that the Honda just feels nicer. The Honda brakes also felt much more confidence-inspiring for highway application compared to the Himalayan's brakes that couldn't inspire the same level of confidence. But did you notice, when referring to the Honda, I invariably ended up talking about feeling nicer? Well, that is an example of subjectivity that could be influenced by my personal bias. Let me show you something. This is my 2013 Honda CBR 250R, and this is my 2015 Honda CBR 650F. And then this is a 2019 Honda Grom I bought to teach my wife how to ride. The point I'm trying to make is that my familiarity with Hondas for more than a decade now is something that you need to be aware of when I'm talking about subjective things like feel. On my part, I deliberately cross-reference my observations with other reviewers and ownership reviews as well. For example, I spotted a peculiar difference between the two bikes that I wasn't expecting at all. The NX does not like going anywhere close to the top end, and that behavior seems to be common on that entire platform. I discovered that while comparing the three Hondas for another comparison video last week. It actually starts to feel rough and vibey compared to how it was just a minute ago in mid-revs. The Himalayan, on the other hand, starts to get smoother as the revs climb and settle around 7,000 RPMs. Of course, neither bike likes to be redlined. In fact, no bike likes to be redlined except maybe race bikes. But thankfully, both bikes have their own zen-like sweet spots for highway cruising. And to make sure it's not just in my head, I watched a few other reviews, and it seems like everyone's feeling the same way. But I was pleasantly surprised to observe that the Himalayan throttle was almost as smooth and crisp as the Honda. But you know what? I realized something. Everyone keeps saying smooth throttle, snatchy throttle, but I remembered I never understood what that meant when I was a newbie rider. But let me show you something. This is my 2021 Yamaha XSR 900, and even though the triple cylinder engine is definitely smoother, the initial twist of the throttle is just very abrupt. And this stuff counts when you're riding at slow speeds, around town, or in stop-go traffic. It just bothers you until you either get used to it or get it tuned. The Honda really isn't bad, but the Himalayan just feels like it's been deliberately tuned for easy low-speed throttle modulation. But here's a nuanced difference between the two at low speeds. The Himalayan has a lug-along, tractor-like character, while the Honda has a little more go to it. Now, which one do you like depends on your personal riding style and riding conditions. If you're an off-road enthusiast and you compare that with your dirt or off-road bike, you're probably gonna appreciate the tractor vibe of the Himalayan. But if you're a city rider, the NX500's slight pep in low revs might be more useful to you to quickly grab a spot in rush hour traffic. The perception of vibrations is also dependent on your own experience. If you're coming from a bone-shaking Harley from back in the day or a commuter single-cylinder motorcycle, both the NX and the Himalayan could feel smoother to you. But if you're used to inline 4 sport bikes or 6-cylinder Grand Tours, you might not find either bike smooth. So I keep that in mind when I watch other people's reviews. For example, being a small channel, I don't get access to ride media bikes off-road for days on end, and I cannot afford to buy every motorcycle that I want to thoroughly review. So for my off-road due diligence, I pick a variety of reviewers with varying experiences and skill levels, absorb everything they say, and then use my own knowledge and experience of how equipment impacts things like performance, grip, and handling, and then summarize everything in a succinct and objective way to save you time and hopefully reduce the confusion of seemingly conflicting opinions. For example, a hardcore rider jumping the Himalayan off a berm doesn't make it a dirt bike. Granted, Himalayan has more suitable front wheel size, they're spoked, suspension travels more, and ground clearance is about 2 inches higher, but both have a fundamental limitation. They're just too heavy to be treated like dirt bikes. In my opinion, both are ideal for light off-road at best. You'll be fine on gravel, hard-packed dirt roads, and green or easy trails. People who are just getting into off-road riding or want to ride off-road at an easy, relaxed pace would be fine on either bike. It's just that the NX would reach the limits of suspension travel and ground clearance a little earlier than the Himalayan. Plus, Himalayan's low-end torque and easier throttle modulation would also make navigating the slow stuff off-road a little more convenient. I remember thinking about that when I was riding a CRF in the forests of Virginia. I actually found the Himalayan throttle to be much better tuned than the most popular beginner dual sport bike ever made. If you have owned and ridden either bike or other bikes off-road, I would love to hear your opinion in the comments on that topic. But when it comes to comfort, suspension is the major difference between the two. Even though neither suspension is adjustable, Himalayan just straight up wins it. Wait, am I sounding like a Himalayan salesman already? Well, wait till you get to the reliability chapter of the video. That said, the Himi, as it's called by the owners, does have a much better damped suspension for on and off-road application, and it works for most riders. But the NX500? Well, it's a mishmash of a stiff front and a wallowy rear suspension. But here's what disappointed me more than the suspension. Everybody complained about it, but nobody delved into why is it like that and what's the solution. You see, the problem is simple. Honda clearly wanted the NX to retain the CB500X comfort, but also carve canyons like the CBR 500R. Unfortunately, they got the worst of both worlds. Instead of being comfy, the rear suspension ended up being vague to sport touring enthusiasts like me. I love the front suspension for how quickly it tips into turns, but the rear gives no feedback once I'm leaned over, and that completely robs me of mid-turn confidence. For everyday street riding though, the rear could feel wallowy to the nitpickers and unremarkable at best to everybody else. But the front, well, it's just stiff AF for most of us. Unless of course you're always on smooth tarmac. The solution, therefore, is a suspension upgrade. Although there is a tiny problem with that I'll come back to once I'm done complaining about the tires, because I have experience with both the Seats and the Dunlops, and I know that neither set is designed for performance. They're designed for people who gripe about tire life. If you care about performance instead, I'll link a set of Michelins that, in my experience, strike a pretty good balance of performance and durability. But remember, when you're pushing it really hard, you cannot really have both in the same tire. But that's a topic for another video in the weeks to come. But the one thing NX does noticeably better than the Himalayan is changing directions or swerving. That's largely down to the 19-inch front wheel instead of a 21. But despite that big wheel, Himalayan was surprisingly better planted mid-turn thanks to a well-damped suspension. If you are a Honda lover willing to spend the money on suspension upgrades, the NX can definitely be transformed into a great sports touring bike. But to me personally, despite upgrading suspensions on all of my race bikes, a tiny problem is that I just don't love the NX enough to spend that kind of money on it. Because to me, motorcycling, especially touring, should be fun, safe, and affordable. That's why I highlight useful upgrades and call out the marketing gimmicks. Over the next few weeks, I plan to share more insights based on my touring and track experience. If that's valuable to you, subscribe to watch weekly content that puts your safety and wallet first. And on the topic of wallets, let's compare which one gives you more bang for your buck. Spoiler alert, it may not be the expensive one. The Honda costs twice as much as the Himalayan in India, but that's down to tariffs on imports. But even in the US, the NX500 is of course priced higher. Thankfully around here, it's not that steep of a jump that it couldn't justify the build quality, an extra cylinder, smoothness, and better service and aftermarket support. But when it comes to bells and whistles, the Himalayan does seem to jingle a lot more. You get a USB charging port under the dash, easily adjustable seat, a rear rack, a bash plate, and a center stand. All of that as standard on the Himalayan, but optional extras on the NX. The few frills the NX has over the Himi are an adjustable brake lever and an adjustable windshield, which does need tools. Also, a switchable traction control, but in my mind, switchable traction control on a 47 horsepower NX500 is just as much of a gimmick as riding modes on a 40 horsepower Himalayan. For instance, I've never used anything but full power mode on my 116 horsepower XSR 900. Sure, traction control with that kind of power is helpful in low traction scenarios, but if you're unintentionally spinning the wheel of a 47 horsepower motorcycle, you don't need more electronics. You need to learn throttle modulation. Share this video with your friend who thinks more electronics make them a better rider. But don't get me wrong, I'm not saying all electronic rider aids are pointless. For street application, I appreciate the standard ABS on the NX500, but just like that, I also get the attractiveness of rear switchable ABS on the Himalayan for those of you who know how to controllably slide the rear wheel. Key word being control. Both bikes have Bluetooth connectivity, but neither implementation is perfect. The Himi has Google Maps, but your phone screen must remain unlocked for it to work. That is silly. The NX has a native navigation app, but it's not as good as Google or Apple Maps. The ideal solution is an Apple or Android CarPlay screen that connects wirelessly with your phone. I'll link an option that I came across, especially if you use your phone for navigating on long distance trips. Which brings me to fuel efficiency and range. Being a smaller single, the Himalayan is more fuel efficient. But for a twin, the Honda is exceptionally fuel efficient, so you get similar fuel range. Of course, real world numbers depend on your riding style and conditions, but the biggest flaw with the Royal Enfield, at least at the moment, is a poor service network in context of the US. Even in India, forums are full of poor service stories and common reliability issues. It seems as if product development and marketing campaigns are getting a lot more management focus than quality and service. By the way, if you're curious, just read the comments on Royal Enfield promotional video for their service centers. And I'm not saying 100% of Royal Enfield owners face those issues, but it does seem like the number of bad experiences are just noticeably higher. But does that mean Hondas don't have issues? Well, generally they are more reliable. I've ridden them for over 100,000 miles. My friend in that picture is still riding his CBR 250R 12 years later. But I like to spend a sizable amount of time researching ownership forums as well. The previous gen CB500X had occasional reports of rear wheel bearings going bad and failing water pumps. I found one report of a NX500 in India with an alignment issue. The bike kept pulling in one direction, I believe. While most of the issues can be repaired under warranty, you'd better hope they come up within the first year, if at all, because at least in the US, Honda only offers a 1-year warranty as opposed to Royal Enfield's 3-year window across the globe. And yet, if and when you're done with the bike, the Honda is going to have significantly higher resale value than the Royal Enfield, because overall the NX has better fit and finish, it has a reputation for reliability, and in my mind it is a more appropriate option for paved highway touring lovers who occasionally go trail riding. But it could be a bad choice if the suspension feels too stiff for your preference and you're not willing to spend the money on suspension upgrade. Therefore, I would highly recommend test riding it instead of only listening to me or any other reviewer. The Hemi, on the other hand, comes pretty damn good out of the box and at a reasonable price. It's a gem for lovers of simplistic motorcycles that lets you explore places on a budget. Even the aftermarket accessory options are pretty cheap, but if bulletproof reliability and strong service network are important to you, you're probably better off looking elsewhere. You can watch this video to compare the NX with other Hondas, or this one to compare the Himalayan with another Royal Enfield. But remember, it's not a question of which bike is better as per the reviewer. It's a question of which one fits your riding style and preferences in the best possible way. And you are the only expert of that. This is Faraz telling you like it is, one video at a time.